So we're, yeah, sorry for some of the gremlins here. We're just kind of trying to get set up. You're very welcome to this evening's discussion on just transition in the Green New Deal and COVID-19. This is, as you can tell, this is the first time that we're using the live stream for the first words from Colin. We're going to pass you over to our partners, I guess, from the Department of International Development in Maynooth, Dr. Eilish Dillon, and she's going to introduce you to our guests. I guess what I want to do is to thank Concern, first of all, for making these discussions possible, to thank our participants. Ask you to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We hope to have a few more of these coming out. And yeah, I'm just going to pass you over to Eilish now.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. Hi, everyone. You're all very welcome to our discussion this evening on the Green New Deal, just transition and COVID-19. And we'll be exploring the implications of COVID-19 for environmental justice, climate change, activism and sustainability, and for the realization of climate justice more broadly, I suppose, and the EU's Green Deal presented in December 2019. So this evening we're going to focus on the kinds of things we need to think about and act upon to realize a Green New Deal and just transition. While most attention has turned to dealing with the pandemic, we've seen massive changes, of course, in what we have often taken for granted as normal. Economies have been practically shut down and people in lockdown, as we know, around the world. And in some countries, many countries, people are experiencing appalling state repression. In many countries also, the impact of years of cuts and austerity to cuts to public funding in health, education and care work have had impacts that we still don't fully understand. And while some people are talking about new normals, many are marveling at the extent of change that's required in order to stop or reduce carbon emissions by even a small proportion of what's necessary. So while the pandemic is like a monolith in public consciousness, most people realize it may be just a tiny indication of what's to come if climate change isn't tackled. Where governments have been forced to tackle the pandemic, where is the public and political will to address climate change and the need for just transformations in tandem? What are the challenges and where's the hope? And these are just some of the issues that we'll be discussing this evening. So I'd like to say thanks very much for coming along this evening and to welcome our speakers. And I'm joined this evening by three really experienced people who have a long track record in research, publication and activism around climate justice. We've Dr. Conor McCabe, who's the researcher and author of Sins of the Father, The Decisions that Shaped the Irish Economy, and the book on money, and he's been writing more recently around just transitions. Dr. Lorna Gold is a Scottish-Irish academic, a climate campaigner, and author of Climate Generation, Awakening to Our Children's Future. She's been involved in the Fridays for Future climate strike since it started in Ireland, and she worked for Trócaire for many years. And I'm also joined by Sean McCabe from TASC. Prior to joining TASC, Sean worked as a policy officer with the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice, for 5 years, and during that time he engaged with the negotiations leading to the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So you're all very welcome. Thanks a million for being part of this discussion this evening, and thanks to everybody who has joined us and who's tuning in from around the world, or who will tune in the future at some stage. And I hope that you find the discussion very interesting and helpful for your own consideration around these issues. So I'm going to start first of all and ask our speakers, if you wouldn't mind, just to be a little bit personal to start off, I'd like to ask you how you got involved in this whole area of environmental or climate justice activism and with these issues in the first place. What was it that inspired you? Can you remember what it was all about and what has driven your engagement with these issues over many years? Over to you, who'd ever like to start?
It's always hard to be the first, isn't it?
Yeah. Thanks, Lorna.
I might start. I mean, I think I've been involved in activism and climate change since I was very, very young. Like as a teenager, I was very involved in these issues, and then went into academia to kind of research, and then ended up in Trócaire, leading the policy team and doing climate advocacy. But I think for me, it became personal, really, I have to say, when I had my own kids, and working alongside Professor John Sweeney from Maynooth, and suddenly realising the timelines on this were very, very close. They weren't kind of far, far distant in the future. The changes we needed to make were really, we were really on the cusp of something very serious and irreversible that's going to affect all our children. And of course, working in Trócaire, it became something we dealt with every single day, the impact, the kind of multiplier effect of climate change. And ever since then, like, it's just become something that I'm just so passionate about, and yeah, it takes up a lot of my headspace most of the time. Although the coronavirus is trying to get in there as well now and occupy a lot of my head. So it's good to have conversation joining them both together.
That's brilliant, Lorna. Thanks a million. I've seen a few times a graphic that you've posted on Twitter that I find really, really powerful, and it's got to do with that timeline thing and realization. I think. Do you know the one I'm talking about? You know the way everybody's now. Sorry, go ahead.
It's like a rainbow, and it's the trajectories of climate change with my my very heteronormative parenting in the axis at the bottom, telling me when I'm going to become a grandmother and when my children are going to get married and everything. But no, it was written as a kind of doodle on the back of an envelope, but it seemed to capture people's imagination because it just kind of puts yourself in it. It's not something far away. It's something that, a bit like coronavirus, actually, something we all feel kind of we're part of. It's part of our story now. So yeah.
And just one other comment before we move on. I remember being at a seminar with you, it might be 3 or 4 years ago. And up until that point, in my own head, I was thinking about climate change in the future. And you were making very strongly the point at the time that climate change has already happened. This is now going back a number of years. I can't remember how many years ago it was, but still in all, I thought it was a very powerful realization at some stage that you have to know, and I think most people know it now, but I hadn't it so clearly in my consciousness at the time. We're not talking about some future date thing here. We're talking about what is and already has happened. I don't know if you want to make any comments on that.
Yeah, no, I think I've had a few of those moments where it's just hit me, like how that this is happening now. And I think that really comes, I think we all see it around us now, but I think we working in an aid agency and seeing the impacts, we were hearing these stories from our partners overseas in Trócaire for a decade. And then we did this piece of research called Feeling the Heat. And that might have been the launch of that you're talking about, where we presented the data on the impacts of climate change across a range of development issues and health issues. And it became so clear to us that this is not, we have the luxury in Western European countries really of being able to see this as something we can project far away in the future still, even now. Whereas people who are now living, I'll talk a bit later about what's happening in many African countries where this is climate injustice and climate change is as bad as ever. And now there's the confluence of the crises that are happening now with coronavirus, and it's really scary what potentially could happen in the next few months, next couple of years.
Okay. Thanks, Lorna. Sean or Conor, would you like to tell us a little bit about how you got involved, or what were the kind of, I suppose, the motivators or the key moments for you?
Yeah, I mean, just for myself, I mean, it's an outgrowth of my own kind of research and my own kind of frameworks that I use in terms of feminist economics and social reproduction, you know, and certainly, from that, it's in terms of these issues and, you know, how they interact with kind of workers' rights, trade unions, the institutional left, which is those kind of organizations. What's their response? How to speak to that? And then also in terms of power. So like the one thing that runs through like my research is in terms of Ireland, it's looking at issues of how power works in Ireland, how does it reproduce itself, what are its kind of blockages, and you see that in terms of finance. So, you know, how finance will shape climate action to its own profit-seeking strategies. You know,
can you explain that can you explain that in what that means?
Well, I mean, if you take, for example, for one thing that we'll talk about kind of later on, in terms of COVID-19, the government's business supports, which you would expect to be a bit stronger, are more focused on making sure that banks can make a profit from giving out loans to like companies than anything else. In terms of the ECB and its Green New Deal, in the language, it talks about private sector buy-in for investment, and it talks about 260 billion per year investment, or kind of 1.5 trillion over 10 years. But it's not talking about public investment here. It's talking about using some kind of loans from the private sector. So when the private sector kind of comes in, it's not as a kind of non-profit Kumbayana type of way of like seeing things, you know. It's there to make money. So it will make investment strategies based on yield, based on its return. That's the nature of the beast. So it will make strategies and investment strategies as to where credit should go based on its own shareholder value needs, rather than any kind of wider societal needs. And we see that even today with kind of COVID, you know, and they'll do exactly the same as they are doing in terms of like climate action.
So was that kind of your starting kind of, I suppose, impetus or motivation for concern was around the whole power and the economy and how capitalism works? And
yeah, I mean,
is that a fair way to say it?
Well, let's say that it's the one thing that I maybe bring to the table. That's all.
Right.
You know, I mean, you know, there's a, you know, this is a kind of collective, you know, kind of response in terms of the Irish left or the European left. This is something that I know about. So it's about bringing that little bit of knowledge and like hopefully some insight, and then bringing that to the wider table. You know, it's that. It's having that confidence in our own knowledge as a movement, and knowing that each of us has kind of blind spots, but that together we probably could have something that's a bit more decent. And this is something that I've spent decades kind of researching. You know, it's very narrow, but hopefully it'll feed into it. So you see it in terms of the ETB, you see it in terms of banks here, you see it in terms of the civil service, how it thinks. You know, Ireland as a tax haven, just going back to kind of Lorna's working role, and me kind of Troika has been excellent, you know, in terms of that, you know, like, you know, how that actually plays in. There's no room for tax havens in like climate action, none whatsoever, you know.
Okay, brilliant. We'll come back to we'll come back to some of those kind of some of the bigger issues, if you like, later on. I just want to go to Sean first on this more personal kind of start off question, if you don't mind. I'm writing down though, there's no room for tax havens in relation to climate justice. Thanks very much for that. Sean, what about yourself?
Thanks, Ailish. It's funnily enough, it was probably in a tax haven that I came to my realization of climate justice. Maybe for the first time, I was working in Bermuda, actually, studying catastrophic risk for a reinsurance company. And it was in 2007, and there was a hurricane blown up into the Bay of Bengal. And when there would be an active storm like that, all the reinsurers would receive hourly updates that would tell you some of the parameters of the storm, what they were, what they could anticipate in terms of loss, and then loss of lives as well. And this one storm that blew into Bengal, the numbers for the death toll kept rising. The expectation of the death toll kept rising, and the insured loss stayed at zero. And I think in that there's a significant injustice, and we can track that through many other catastrophic storms that you know, have impacted, say, the US, but have, prior to impacting the US, hit the Caribbean islands. And the death toll is different, and the economic repercussions is very different. And so very short time later, 3 years later, I found myself working in Calcutta doing something completely different, and in those communities that had experienced the loss. And they told me, it was in the Sundarbans down around, and they were telling me about the effort of the community lifting bodies out of ditches to for weeks after the event. So for something that in an office in a tax haven, as we say, registers as a zero for insured repercussions or cost to any of us, it has a very human side. So I guess I pursued that and stumbled into climate justice that way, but at the time I had no idea what climate justice was. You're on mute there, Ailish.
Thanks, John. Sorry, thanks for that. Thanks for your example. And also, I was just going to say, maybe we'll follow up from there, maybe we'll start with you, if you wouldn't mind, just telling us a little bit about your understanding of this notion, first off, of Green New Deal, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the EU's Green Deal and just maybe some of the key points in it, and then we'll look at some of your thoughts on it, strengths and weaknesses, challenges related to it, etc. Is that okay, Sean?
Sure, Ilse. Well, I guess it's very important, first of all, to differentiate between concepts of New Deal and Green New Deal and the EU Green Deal. They're two very different things. The New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, traces back to 1938, and it was actually an effort to tackle the concentration of private power and inequality, which was at record levels. And so those who call upon the New Deal, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or others, even in Barcelona right now, there's some fantastic work going on there around a New Deal at the municipal level, are very focused on the inequality dimension, and are very aware that in undertaking climate action, if we don't undertake inequality, tackling inequality at the same time, we'll probably render all of our work futile. So there's that side of it, and then I suppose on the back of all of the incredible work of the young people across Europe over the past and the world over the past couple of years, the EU has been compelled into adopting the Green Deal, which is a slight co-option of the New Deal framing. But they would call it a roadmap for the economic transformation required to a sustainable future. And it encompasses everything that anyone who's familiar with discourse around climate action, would be used to. So changes to transportation, changes to how we get our energy, changes to how we produce our food. But what it doesn't focus on, where a new deal would focus, is on participation, is on democratization, is on who controls what I suppose, who controls how climate action is undertaken. And so you already have a situation where, I suppose, 5 of, research from Friends of the Earth Europe highlighted that between 2010 and 2020, there was about 251 million spent by oil and gas lobbyists at the EU level. So you have, as you had with the Sustainable Development Goals, this focus on the role of the private sector, and Conor spoke about that earlier, and the private sector being the enabler of us to do all of these great things, which, personally speaking, is, I think, an untenable risk to be taking at this point in time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sean. And just from Conor, Lorna, or Sean yourself, either, if you'd like to just chat a little bit more about what you see as kind of, I suppose, the strengths or weaknesses of the EU Green Deal versus this more broader New Green Deal approach or New Deal approach. Lorna, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think Sean has pretty much nailed it there in saying it's the Green Deal that the EU is putting forward has nothing to do with shifting power structures or re-democratization. And I think that it's very narrow compared to, let's say, the Green New Deal for Europe, which has 10 different pillars, is focused on get power strategies to bring power back into communities, around sustainable food systems, all those things that would bring power away from centralised monopolies back down to the local levels. This Green Deal, and as you were speaking there, Sean, and mentioning the SDGs, I was thinking, gosh, yeah, 2015, I was in Addis Ababa when the Financing for Development Summit took place, which was meant to address how do we, it was really the moment to move the world on a path to a real Green New Deal. We didn't call it that back then, but that's what it was attempting to do. And I remember sitting there when Joe Stiglitz presented the findings of the International Commission on Corporate Tax Reform. Amazing recommendations around how to close down the tax havens, how to facilitate international tax cooperation, really addressing power structure, taking away that private power and putting it back into the realm of taxation, because at the end of the day, tax is meant to be about what's in the best interest for the common good. That was blocked by OECD countries then. And what resulted out of that and out of the SDGs and then the Paris Agreement was really watered down as a result of the fact that nothing substantial was achieved in terms of addressing power imbalances. And they had the chance to do it, and we lobbied really hard, and Ireland and others all blocked this move to bring corporate tax reform, international tax haven measures into the heart of the SDG agenda. It was just kind of pushed out the way. And what we saw, and I remember blogging about it at the time, was the SDGs launched by private corporations in 2015. I'll never forget seeing the concert to launch, I wasn't at the concert, but I remember seeing the concert advertised to launch the SDGs, sponsored by Gucci and Citibank, which would just seem the biggest irony in history in terms of affluence, consumption, conspicuous consumption, everything that scientists are telling us we need to recompose our consumption in order to address climate injustice. So yeah, I think you're spot on there in terms of that's missing, completely missing. This will see a further entrenchment of private investments. It's the green economy agenda, which is some of it is not too bad. Some of it needs to happen overall, but it's missing the bigger piece. And I think that's, to me, where the coronavirus discussion comes into play potentially.
Great, we'll come back to that in a sec. Conor, did you want to add to anything there, or is that okay?
No, it's, I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, it's that kind of point that this is not there are no market like solutions to like climate action. This is a structural issue, and it's an ideological one as well. And that's the kind of and I mean kind of ideology there in terms of common sense. And I mean the institutional common sense. I mean, like this is something that I would have come across just for years in terms of Ireland. And I know more about Ireland, so I'll use that, more as kind of examples. But you get this incredible well-meaning, but totally useless kind of common sense that just runs through kind of state and any kind of private sector kind of organizations. It's that kind of, it's that way of how things are done, and it's way of thinking. It's that old cliche where there are hammers and everything, it's a nail, so everything can be fixed by price signals. So this is one thing, that if you just price things accordingly, then we'll have kind of climate action. I mean, this is just kind of one example of it. So you see it. So I mentioned that because it's something that's very, very difficult to challenge, because it's actually not to the fore of the minds of those who are making kind of policy kind of decisions. It's one of the more frustrating things. There's no conspiracy. It's not a basement, where you all kind of carve out these ideas. Maybe with kind of Goldman Sachs, but apart from them, like for other humans and those of the human race, it isn't actually done that way. It's worse. It's just that's the way things are done. This is how you solve these problems. Why wouldn't you use kind of market signals? I mean, that's how things are done here. So so the problem is more than just about kind of individual consumer choices or any kind of market-based kind of solutions or tweaking taxes. This is structural, so it demands a structural kind of response, and the private sector just isn't big enough for a structural kind of response. For all the talking around Apple or banks or Amazon, they all crap themselves every time there's a big crisis, because only states can really have the firepower to actually do things that actually have a difference. And we see that twice in the last 12, 14 years. So climate action, it's no different. This is going to take massive state led impetus. At the same time, just going back to Sean's point, that even if it is kind of state led, it needs to be democratized as well. And just because it's state led, that's not the same thing. It needs to be decentralized as well. That has to be from the community upwards. And again, just going back like to Ireland, because I know it, there is a huge fear of the local in this state, massive fear of it. Look at our local government structures. It is just incredible how the state is fearful of its own citizens, and one of the problems with this kind of citizen is that I can't read the room. There's no room to read, so I don't know when to shut up.
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask you to just to halt there for one sec. Yeah. But I think you've made some really, well, all of you in different ways have made really interesting points. But that last point that you were making there, well, about the just that it's not necessarily about a conspiracy. It's taken for granted approaches to how things are going. Lorna, would you like to come in there?
Well, I'm not going to come in and say it's all a conspiracy. That's certainly not. I'm not a conspiracy theorist or a fan of conspiracy theories. But I think it's more like there's organized power, and they have massive influence over certain decisions. Obviously, you agree. You're nodding there as well. Like I'm thinking the fossil fuel industry in particular. Like so. The amount of money that is then channeled back into lobbying, back into pseudo-academic institutions, and then finds its way into the public narrative. So it just depends where conspiracy begins and ends when you look at the like of the Koch brothers or and their influence over chairs of universities in the US and political campaigns and everything. So yeah, so I think there's like, I wouldn't buy the conspiracy theories, but I think there's dark money there that's shaping things under the surface in a significant level. Now,
Which brings us to some of the, I guess, the kind of the challenges involved in addressing some of these bigger structural issues, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But just before we get on to some of that more, I suppose, what are some of the specific challenges and responses? I'd just like to open it up about what you think are the, I suppose, the implications for climate action and for understanding these challenges of COVID-19 and of the pandemic. And earlier, I think it was you, Lorna, who talked about a confluence of crises. And I was struck by that term. And well, I just more generally, I suppose, what do you think, what are the implications for climate action, for climate justice, for that proper kind of Green New Deal arising from the pandemic? And I'm thinking some of those are probably positive, some of them are negative, and some of them have potential, but maybe, you know, that it depends on how it's used. Sean, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, I suppose you're right, Eilish. There's a real spectrum of, I think the first observation is to say, well, now we know what it means to respond to an emergency. I think that's the, you know, what we're facing in terms of the climate crisis is so much greater in terms of the loss of life, in terms of instability politically, in terms of it's very, very hard to comprehend how terrible things could get and how quickly that could happen. But we know now that actually we have the mechanisms to react if push comes to shove. And I would argue as well, if the catastrophe can be felt by those making the decisions. What I would think is that my big fear about this, it's good to see a lot of talk of the just recovery, which is building the kind of just transition concept into how we re-emerge from the COVID-19 crisis. But a significant fear I would have is that we will fall into a space where rightly the focus will be about jobs, will be about people's livelihoods, people's well-being at home, and the window of opportunity to discuss climate will be narrower rather than the two overlapping, which I think, you know, it's very important. We've spent an awful lot of time trying to push climate action onto the home, and so when you talk to people, they think it's about higher taxes, they think it's about spending money to retrofit homes or buy electric vehicles. It's actually about, as both Lorna and Conor have said, it's about very deep systematic reform, and there is an opportunity now to start critically looking at systems, like even the concept of the financial rules that govern the EU, that like they have to change for a response to COVID-19 to be successful, and they have to change for a response to the climate crisis to be successful. And now's the time to unpick that. But my fear is we, and Conor's paper speaks to this, the risks are we might fall down an austerity route that kills any opportunity to undertake climate action for another 10 years.
Can you say a little bit more about what that actually might look like, and why, I suppose, changing the financial rules are so important, and not, you know, I suppose, following the same or a similar kind of an economic path as was followed after the last recession crisis?
Conor would be better able to speak to that than me, yeah. But I just say real quick that my perception of it is we have two paths that we can go down in terms of how we take climate action. And one is that you force austerity on people because it's necessary to take climate action, or you force the cost of the action onto the individuals. And that would be tremendously unjust. And not only that, it'd fail because everyone would revolt. And in addition, it doesn't take in the global dimension at all, which we have to start working on very quickly. We're only talking about doing domestic action, but we have to start talking about doing global action in solidarity with much poorer countries. So, but that's
okay. Great, Sean. Lorna or
maybe,
Conor,
yeah, maybe I can pick up on that.
Sure.
So I mean, I'd share this sense that like we really are in the thick of it at the moment. I think any thoughts about what comes next are kind of turning around in our heads. And I think one thing we can say, and I think Sean already said, like we now know what an emergency response really looks like, and the scale of the emergency we're facing for climate change is far more severe and far bigger than what we're facing just now. I would say, like, one of the things that really strikes me, and I don't know if the others would agree, is like the free market ideology has been dealt a very severe body blow through this. I mean, if you think what governments could have done in response to if they'd acted in the same way as they acted in relation to climate change in face of the coronavirus, we would be sitting here with tens of thousands of deaths in Ireland. It's the reality of it, because they would have sat back and gone, well, the market will sort it out. But the market, as Conor said, like it's actually, as a very pricing and markets, it's a very narrow narrative, and a very narrow perspective to deal with an emergency situation. So I think what it's really thrown apart is that idea that you just leave it to the market. It's grotesque, actually, grotesque. It would have been unpalatable for people, frankly stupid. Like, so that idea that there's a new common sense now, there's a new common sense that's how we need to do things differently. And I think that's opened up a new narrative of collective action. And I think that's, to me, the one positive that could emerge from this. Is that we can bend curves together. And if you think, I did that graph of the curve going up, and what I drew was this people pulling the curve down. And that's the narrative that's out there in relation to the coronavirus, that we can collectively achieve a goal in the face of a crisis. So to me, that's really a positive narrative that could help us bring people on board and like move forward. But I mean, I'm still very much kind of looking at the kind of the real crisis dimension of this, and as I mentioned, what this is potentially doing internationally. And I see no sense of leadership or change at an international level. This bending the curve is in our self-interest as a nation, and it's all on a national level. And the EU has been very weak in a collective response. And then you look even more internationally and you see what's happening and the projections in Africa in relation to the kind of, if the coronavirus now connects with the locust plague in the north, in the Horn and north of Africa, and then if you look at the drought in Zimbabwe and the hunger and the diversion of resources, if we go back to an austerity model, what's the first thing to drop is ODA, is overseas aid, and any kind of finance. So I'm looking, it looks very, very bleak, and the World Food Organization, the FAO, the World Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN this week projected a warning that there could be a biblical scale famine on the continent of Africa, involving 30 countries and hunger, 255 million people facing hunger by the end of this year, unless there is a serious change of direction. And it's in a sense the multiplier effects of climate change then coming together with the breakdown of multilateralism as a result of, or it's not quite breakdown at this stage, but the kind of dog-eat-dog mentality that's prevailed at an international level due to coronavirus is is quite frightening, to be honest. And I think the leadership, where's the leadership coming from to address this? That's where what I'm really concerned about at an international level.
And just one thing before I move over to you, Conor, what would that serious change of direction look like, Lorna? Sorry, that's like $1 million question probably, but
what was
it's just in your head, like when you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several things that could be done at a UN level. I think bringing it's about the leadership. Like, so where's the leadership coming from to prioritise international overseas aid, the redirecting financial flows towards those countries that are in serious difficulty. I think debt relief has to be back on the table, where debt is linked to addressing these multiple crises, because we're looking now at another debt crisis as a result of the levels of spending that are need to be addressed by these countries to address coronavirus and the other concerns. But yeah, it's very, very hard to see where the leadership will come from to address that on the internet. That's not giving very much hope. But I think we're at a level, I think the level of crises now is at a stage where we need something new on the table. And to me, that's the Green New Deal in terms of at a global level, and looking at a kind of the various different policy proposals that would make up the Green New Deal at an international level.
Okay, I guess I could ask what's the likelihood around all of that, and maybe what are the paths towards it. But I'll just ask those questions, and maybe we'll come back to that if you might just think a little bit about that. How to do that? What needs to happen in order for that to be done? Conor, would you like to make any comments there in terms of that? I suppose leadership, some of the challenges presented by COVID, the change in direction that's required, or what the implications of COVID and the pandemic are for climate action in your view?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to think of the right words for this, because I don't want to sound cold, but like COVID-19, it is an opportunity, because this needs deep kind of structural change. One of the tenets, as Sean kind of pointed out, of the New Deal mentality is to avoid austerity and bring in kind of a more kind of just kind of society. Now this is the time for it. If we had done a Green New Deal in 2008 till 2010 all across Europe, we wouldn't have, picture what, like there would have been no Greece, no Ireland, no Spain, no Portugal, you know. But it just wasn't there in terms of the thinking. But we're actually at that moment again, you know. I mean, this is the time for that. Like the EU Commission, you know, in its Green Deal paper, which is quite, you know, light, you know, it's still working out all of its own kind of, you know, it's not going to details on it. Talks around, oh, well, this will cost, I think it said 260 billion per year investment, as if that's a big number. I mean, the ECB last month issued 750 billion in new credit, literally with a flick of a switch. Haven't spent decades saying this cannot be done. It's against kind of EU rules. You know, we need markets to discipline countries. That's what they're there for. You know, to stop them from spending. It's not. It's about profit, because selling credit is a very profitable business. And like, if you have states getting credit, you know, from like central banks, then there's no need for your private kind of investors. There's no need for your IFSC and that whole, all those kind of shenanigans, you know. So like, if they can do this, they've shown, like, one of the things that's happened in the last kind of a month or so is that they've shown that they can do these things. They show that they can take over 19 private hospitals here. They can just do it. I haven't spent since the 1950s telling us this was against the Constitution, that we couldn't do this, private property rights. And because the HSE was under such kind of severe pressure to save its own neck, it did it, you know? Now, we all know that that deal isn't in. That's for another day. But it shows that the tools to fight climate action are already there. There are no technical barriers to doing this. They are purely political, purely political. There are no technical barriers, even in terms of the treaty itself. Like, the ECB can't buy bonds or buy or give kind of credit to states, but it can to the EU by commission. You know, there are ways around this, you know. So, but as we saw there last month, there's fierce, like, political blockage to these things. And it is political, it's not technical. These are kind of political kind of issues. They've shown this. They can take over hospitals. They can issue half of the amount which they say it will take to transform Europe into a carbon neutral space, 1.5 trillion. We did half of that last month in an afternoon. You know?
And Conor, just there's a question after coming in there from Michael Hanley. Thanks, Michael. Just if the panel think that this is an Irish-based question, so we won't spend too long on it, if you don't mind, but just to address it. And in response to what you were just saying, Conor, like, do you think the new government in Ireland will take the environment much more seriously?
No.
What kind of level of confidence do you have?
As I'm on kind of full steam, I'll just, like, plow ahead anyway. But, like, no, they've shown us in their response to the Green Party. There's a couple of lines in there, just in that kind of document, where they give like, it's yeah, but no, but yeah, but no, but. I mean, that's basically like 7 pages of that, like, you know. But like, even in terms of the LNG terminals, which has to be non-contentious, to have a country that has banned fracking to say that we won't import frack gas. And they said, yeah, well, you know, can we have this for private sector investment? If it's like, you know, if the private sector builds these terminals, you know, can we intervene? And they're going, I never realized that climate action has less of an impact if it's private sector money. This is all news to me, you know? So, I mean, they've shown what their thinking is. The Greens asked about, you know, having a stakeholder forum going forward in terms of a new Ireland and the green issues. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael straight back saying, we'd love it, of course we do. But we reserve the right as a government to set policy. It's just in the last line of it. It's very, very clear. Talk all you want, lads, but we'll make the final kind of call here. We may throw you some bones, but that's about it, like, you know. So they made it very, very clear, and that's in their opening paper. They made it very, very clear that there's nothing happening here. And they've also said that, okay,
thanks, Conor. Sean or Lorna, do you want to get in on that, or shall we move on? I'm trying to think about, there's another area of questions that I want to look at, which is, I suppose, this sense of like, what are the kind of, I suppose, the possible dangers at the moment facing us in terms of the way forward, and kind of, I suppose, the concerns that any of you might have, and like, that might be one of them. I suppose it's something that I'm very conscious of myself, that, you know, rhetoric is easy, but realizing or implementing policy is much more difficult. And often people and governments say the right things, but they don't necessarily follow up as a result of it. So that might be one very small, minor kind of an area. I was also struck by what you said earlier on there, Sean, where you said that it was just a kind of a small comment, but I think it's very important to think about, like, when people don't experience the negative effect of something themselves, they're a lot less likely to embrace that in their own reality or in their change strategies. And I'm wondering, like, is that something that we need to be conscious of? The fact that, you know, so many decisions are made by those who can in some ways protect themselves from the worst effects of climate change. Anyway, they're just two things, but there might be much more important things. So what do you see as, what should we be looking out for in terms of the way forward, I suppose, for this kind of structural change that you're all talking about?
I might just jump in on the lived experience comment, Ailish.
Yeah, great, Sean, thanks.
Because like, I think there's a lot tied up in that. Yes, like when you have a virus that can put Boris Johnson in hospital, you have a response that changes dramatically, and Lorna would be all too aware through her work with Trócaire of the lived experience of people who no longer know when to plant and harvest crops along the Sahel in Africa. You know, there's the impacts of climate change are so severe already for so many communities around the world. It's enormous. Now, that's one piece, which is the understanding that we have to act because it's already causing horrific damage. But the other piece is to respect the lived experience of communities in Ireland, I think, and especially people who are struggling to have income or who are have way more pressing concerns than what the world will look like in 10 years' time, because next week or next month is sufficiently concerning. And so I think food is a really interesting lens to look through this at. If you think about the situation that links our agricultural system and our emissions to the consumer and what they have to do in order to afford food, it really, I think, spells out the spectrum of action needed. So we have farmers that are not being paid enough for their produce. We know that there's a lot of farmers going out of business week by week here because, and it comes back to power structures within the supermarket chains, within the agribusiness sector. You have massive power structures that are putting farmers under enormous pressure. And on the other side of that, you have the same businesses extracting wealth from communities through large supermarkets. So people who are either time poor or cash poor or both have no other option but to shop in massive supermarkets that serve to extract maximum profit from the produce they sell, and the produce they sell is the farmer's produce. So if you want to remedy any side of that, and then of course agriculture is 33% of our emissions. So if you want to square that circle in any way, you have to start talking about, well, maybe a 4-day work week that allows people the time and the luxury to shop for local produce is climate action. And maybe if we think about a living wage that allows people to shop somewhere that is able to pay the producer a fair price, that's also climate action. And even like having somewhere to be able to prepare food, so the right to a home, that too is climate action. So like we spend our whole time focusing on, you know, and it was front page news last week that 7% reductions would devastate farmers. It's the lens through which we look at all of this is nonsense. You know, the 7% reductions have to happen. Like 7% isn't even the half of it. It's like so far away from the actual reductions we need to make, and it's scary when you look at what we have to do. But to spend the whole time just looking at, say, the farmer and saying, well, we need to, like, it's either reducing his herd or global catastrophe. That's a mad dichotomy that we've managed to find ourselves in, especially when on the other side of this, and it's the power structures, but on the other side of this, you have people squeezed to the pin of their collar, having to shop in shops that then pass on the whatever savings they offer on to the producer, who then has to intensify his herd and intensify how he produces food to have any chance of making enough money to send his kids to school or to college or whatever.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Sean. Lorna, I can hear you wanting to get in there, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think your question was around, I wasn't going to say anything particularly about farmers. But I was going to kind of address the question of the kind of fears or what we should be watching out for during as we exit the coronavirus and kind of the whole climate, connect it with climate. I mean, I've already talked about the confluence of crises. I mean, I think that I really think there'll be such a rush to get back to business as usual and normality, that's what really scares me most at the moment. It's really this kind of not to take advantage or see the opportunity that's in the kind of where we're at the moment in order to address the bigger questions of climate, and that they're like what we're not hearing about, that really concerns me. Like the media is completely preoccupied by this virus, and meanwhile in the US whole swathes of environmental legislation are being rolled back. We don't even know what's happening. I'm not assuming it's happening here, but behind the scenes things that are happening and will be happening that the media are not keeping their eye on. So I think as we're coming out of the crisis, I think that we need to have a close eye on that, and we need to really be attentive to this, the kind of any kind of shift right back quickly to kind of business as usual, and the kinds of measures that were put in place after 2008. There was rumor or murmurings about that on the news this evening about imposing austerity. I don't think people will take it, but I think that it's deeply concerning if the cost of this crisis is going to be borne by regular working people, and that there's no way, like it needs to be used in order to address inequalities. I mean, one final thing, and I think this is really concerning from the perspective of activism, but also more broadly, is the whole issue of civil liberties in the post-COVID world, or the kind of new world that we're in. And in a sense, the way that we've moved our lives online with very little regard for our private data. We're in the European Union, we're assuming that we're fine, but the amount of our lives that have now moved online into, and then if we have apps to control the virus, the state control and the corporate control of our private and professional lives is quite mind-blowing. And I think that we're not really seeing that just now, but down the road, how that information and the large volumes of information that are being shared could be used and misused, and could also be used in terms of activism and the way that activism has had to move online as well. It's something that we need to keep an eye on.
Great, thanks, Lorna. Conor, what about yourself in terms of what we might need to be concerned about or to look out for from your perspective?
Well, I mean, like it builds on what like Lorna and Sean have been saying, but like you know, this goes into, they will do all these things. We know that they will. It's Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but only if we let them. You know, I mean, you know, this where it gets into. I mean, we can make kind of predictions, like I can give you kind of predictions as to how I think this next government will like play out, but that's all based on no resistance, that they actually just carry on. So the real thing here is really, you know, it's about resistance, organization, being ready to kind of take on that fight, you know, because, and they will, like they'll fight us tooth and nail for absolutely everything, as we know, like, you know. But that's why, like, you know, I think that there's a room for the trade unions in this, there's a room for political parties in this, and there's a room for other groups that are not in those kind of institutional, kind of aggressive kind of structures, you know, who are that is equally as important. We've seen this in Ireland in the last kind of 5-6 years. I'm not saying that's a template, but we do know that you get numbers out there. If there is kind of resistance, it can have an impact. So for me, it's about, once we're clear as to what we want in broad terms, then it's about, we don't get caught up on the strategies. That's more about, that's where you improvise, and that's where it gets into, we see how they play out these things, and then we hope that we're kind of smart enough to be able to box clever back at them, then as well. One of the things I would have seen over the last over my last years here is that there's a tendency to be rigid in our strategies rather than being rigid in our objectives, and being very flexible in our strategies. That once we know kind of what we want, then it's about, well, we can change around how we get there, as long as they speak to our kind of principles and they speak to our pathway. So if it can be kind of flippant, it's like, the answer is a general strike. What's the question?
Yeah.
So it's about, no, let's look at what we want, which is a kind of, well, for me, it's a kind of an eco-feminist socialist Ireland. And then it's about, like, how we get there is an ongoing kind of dialogue. It used that word praxis, but it's about that. It's about having having the confidence in what we want and the confidence to improvise. And I think that's where it gets kind of really, really interesting. So let's see what strategies and what kind of resistance groups kind of come up with, as long as they speak to an overall overarching a belief system and or kind of vision as to what Ireland and Europe can be. And then after that, let's just have some fun with this. Let's just have the crack fucking taking them on. You know what I mean? So once we know kind of what we want, let's have doing it,
Yeah, brilliant. You're dovetailing me there right into kind of looking, maybe starting to explore, just before we finish up, some of those paths forward for that structural change that we've all been talking about, and where the hope is. I would never have put it that way in myself, in terms of, having fun with it and playing with it, because sometimes it just seems so overwhelming. But I can see your point. And I think that point that you've made there is really interesting. That whole thing about not getting bogged down in the nitty-gritty necessarily of strategies, not saying that they're not important, but being really clear about what I suppose what strategies are trying to achieve.
Move fast and break things.
Move fast and break things. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I mean, as long as you know, like how you keep on the path, just going back to what kind of Lorna and Sean have been putting forward, which is very much that view of there's an overarching vision here. As long as your strategies and tactics speak to that vision and speak to those principles of kind of democracy, and fairness and a more just and kind of Ireland and our future, have the crack with it, you know what I mean? See what we come up with.
Yeah.
Like people are so creative. They're just so creative. I mean, that's where it gets into having a kind of communal, kind of vision as to how to kind of go forward. The things that we could never think of. There's someone now in like Roscommon who's now thinking up these things, apart from yourself now, but but they're, you know what I mean? Like this is where it gets into the fun of it. It's having that confidence in people to see what strategies we come up with, as long as the overall vision is more or less kind of agreed upon. But it is a more kind of democratic and like socially just Ireland, and our kind of Europe and world. And then just people need to have that input, to actually feel that they have ownership. And then that's in them.
Yeah, great. I think one of the things that I spend a lot of my time thinking about is, as I suppose, working in a university context and in higher education, and trying to think about the kinds of critical education that's required in order to help to support the resistance and understanding of what's happening and what the potential for change is. but it's a bit like you say, that's just one small piece of the puzzle around creativity and envisioning and trying to realize the future. And so I'm just wondering, Sean or Lorna, where do you see the paths forward or the hope? Where for you, in the context of it being very frightening and fearful and lots going on, where's the hope?
Well, I might bring us right back to the start of the conversation. But I mean, I think what we're learning, I mean, coronavirus is just such a huge learning curve for us all. And I'm taking away, I think, 3 things from it, really clear kind of things that have a massive implications for climate change. And that's one that, like, the public understands that science has consequences. Scientific facts have consequences. The second thing is that collective action based on a caring society actually works, that we can people will make sacrifices if they understand and they feel that they've got a part to play. So to me, that's huge hope in the midst of a very devastating crisis. And the one final thing I take away from it, and I'm sure all of you, if your radio wakes you up in the morning and you hear that, mine's an Alexa wakes me up and it's that man from the government telling me what I have to do today in relation to the coronavirus. It drives me mad. But the message there is that public message, clear public messaging in a crisis actually works. And if I've heard it once I've heard it a million times that we can't communicate climate change well, I think if we can communicate a virus and we can get people to take action, we can communicate the crisis of climate change, and we can start to bend that curve as well.
Great, thanks, Lorna. And Sean?
Yeah, I think the guys have said a lot of what needs to be said there. There is reasons to be hopeful. For me, it's community. There's been an incredible response around the country from at the local level, and it kind of comes back to both Lorna and Conor touched on it. But Conor touched on it earlier on when he said our government is afraid of local Ireland, and that's why we have disempowered local governance systems. Like, there's a huge amount that once you start spreading your net in your community, you very quickly start to realize how many talented people there are there who could all work for a common purpose. And so as we emerge out the other side of this, I would hope that we would find the processes for genuine participation within our democratic system that recognizes that actually participative democracy is what all of this hinges on in the long run, that people are interested, people are engaged, people understand that decision makers are making decisions about their futures and the futures of their children. And if they're making the wrong decisions, we have to have the pressure on them, both from the streets, but also from the ballot box. And in the long run, then hopefully what you would see is a flourishing of community-led local development that's sustainable, localized economies that provide for immediate need of communities, and move away from this globalized model that just like basically exports suffering and imports emissions.
Okay, great. Anybody like to say anything else just before we wrap up? Anything that's kind of burning for you that you feel that we haven't you haven't had a chance to say?
Well, you know, it kind of struck me that, like, just what kind of Lorna and like Sean said, like what has been brilliant in the last kind of 6 weeks has that view of the community. You know, it's absolutely true that, you know, for years kind of Hollywood told us that, you know, with a virus outbreak, it would lead to shotguns and kind of cannibalism, and really it leads to TikTok and to street bingo. You know, so I mean, we've learned a lot here that Hollywood has lied to us. That's one thing first. And then secondly is that this is it. Like, people don't need to be taught the community. People don't need to be taught to do these things. They're held back from doing these things constantly. But given half a chance, they embrace it. People love people. People are great crack, you know. So I mean, you know what I mean? Like, you know, and like that's what people miss is actually other people. This whole thing that's going on now, like that in itself is a huge, you know, lesson of economics telling us that we're all selfish, and you know, it's nonsense. Anyway, sorry, rant off.
I'd say Margaret Thatcher's famous comment that there is no such thing as society is well and truly dead. I think governments have found out that they really need society now in this to tackle the coronavirus. They need communities, and those countries that are thriving through this, or not thriving, that are managing to get through this, are ones where there are resilient communities. And I'm sure all that research and data will come out in due course. But I think that that's a big learning, and I think that's so positive for the future.
Great, Lorna, and thanks to the three of you, Conor and Sean and Lorna, as you appear on my feed there. I'm told by Mark that there are lots of positive comments coming in on the feed, so everybody wants to say thanks very much for such a really interesting conversation and loads of interesting contributions. Of course, we could be here all evening discussing this, but I'm also conscious that these things have to have a kind of a natural, come to some kind of a natural end. So I'd just like to say thanks in particular to all of you, to everybody who's been joining us for the last hour or so. And do please like and follow the COLOV YouTube channel if you can. And also, if you've any suggestions for conversations like this, or for topics that you'd like us to cover in the first Wednesday discussions or debates, please get in touch with Mark at COLOV, or you can get in touch with me at the Department of International Development in Maynooth. And we're delighted to be able to do this online, given that we can't be together in face to face. But Mark always tries to stream these discussions online. So there's lots of them up there on the COLOV podcast site and on the YouTube channel. So lots of challenges for all of us, but it's really nice, of course, to leave with some hope. And I wish everybody all the best, and thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.